Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 3 of the Certified Specialist of Wines 30-Day Study Sprint. Grape varieties. Today's topic is going to be pretty lengthy, and it really aims to be an introduction to all of the grape varieties that come into play in the later chapters of the book. So we will be covering everything pretty quickly, and hopefully we'll manage to follow along. The first thing to note is some exam questions that could occur. One of which is, which of these grape varieties takes center stage in the red wines of Bordeaux's left bank? So the trick question here is left bank. So if one of the options is Merlot, that would not be correct because that would be a right bank variety. You want to think about Cabernet Sauvignon in this case. They also ask you questions like local terms for certain grapes, like which grape is known as Schwarz Riesling, which kind of means black Riesling, but in this particular case refers to Pinot Meunier. And also kind of, to me, kind of obscure questions like, what is the most planted grape variety in the Montilla Royales DO? In this case, it's Pedro Jimenez, but I think a lot of us know Pedro Jimenez as the sherry, but one may forget that Montilla Morales is where that is produced. With that said, let's move on ahead. Now, what is the main grape species for commercial wine production? The answer is always going to be Vitis vinifera. It's kind of believed that these Vitis vinifera vines were developed in the region between Europe and Asia. Some people say, it came from China. Some people say they started from Georgia. I think, the research is still being done in that area. But we know that Vitis vinifera comes in so many different varieties, and these really emerged due to natural evolution and human intervention. There are other types of grape varieties, of course, like Vitis labrusca, which is kind of native to North America. For example, most of the table grapes we have, but that's rarely used in winemaking. Actually, why American Vitis species are sometimes used is because they are resistant to phylloxera. In the wine world, we keep talking about phylloxera, and that is really an aphid infection. An aphid is an insect that originated in North America, but these really wreaked havoc in European vineyards in the 19th century, which caused most vines to be replanted. So if you look at European vineyards today, most of these vines cannot be older than 100 years old, even if they can survive that long. That's because they all pretty much had to die in the 19th century. Initially, they tried to attempt to hybridize American vines with Vitis vinifera, and hybridize in this case means kind of getting the two Vitis species to interbreed, but it didn't produce any good wines. So instead, what actually happened successfully was to graft Vitis vinifera rootstocks onto American vines. And that preserved the taste of these European wines, but at the same time, it made it phylloxera resistant. So which are some of common American Vitis species to be used as rootstock? There are 4 of these options here. You will need to remember this for the purpose of the exams. It does come up pretty often. And some other key terms that's kind of important to remember for knowledge as well as for the exams. One, what's a species? So Vitis vinifera, for example, is a species. Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon, these are not species. That's the second thing, a variety. Essentially, it's a subspecies in winemaking. The variety is a group of vines or the same species that share characteristics, say Cabernet Franc, for example. And then finally, you've got the crossing, and the crossing is the offspring of sexual reproduction between different varieties of the same species. For example, Cabernet Sauvignon is a cross between Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. All of these are really important to remember for the purposes of the exams. Other key terms include clones. So in most commercial viticulture, most of these grapes are propagated by vegetative propagation. Vegetative propagation. It's a syllable there. And that means that they are planted using cuttings from one parent to really ensure identical genetic characteristics for the whole vineyard. What that means is that when you go to a lot of commercial vineyards, every single plant is actually genetically the same. If you remember your high school biology, if plants reproduce sexually, that means the flowers of different flowers, pollinate each other and new plants come out. These plants are actually not genetically identical. So when you think about most vineyards, it's actually very different from naturally propagated plants. We use the seed, and the seed is genetically not identical to the original parent. To be fair, the usage of specific clones may sometimes be a trade secret for some wineries and vineyards. However, there's just tons of clones available in commercial wineries, as well as commercial nurseries. For example, some Pinot Noir clones are just more suitable for hot conditions. For example, higher yields, thicker skins, etc. Other terms include a term called a mutation. For example, mutations of vine has developed enough characteristics to distinguish it from its parents or other plants. So this rarely happens because most commercial vineyards use clones and they don't actually sexually reproduce. But for example, Pinot Gris is actually a mutation of Pinot Noir. Finally, you've got hybrid. A hybrid is a result of sexual reproduction between two Vitis species. So species is the key word here. So a hybrid, for example, is not between Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon. It's two different species. So it has the, for example, the American Vitis labrusca, and that hybridizes with a European Vitis vinifera grape. And then we come to the question of indigenous versus international varieties. So although all grapes must actually originate from somewhere, so why are some considered indigenous and some international? But the varieties that are prevalent in the New World growing regions are often known as international varieties, while those only found in the Old World are known as indigenous varieties. For example, Italy has thousands of indigenous varieties, and it really just means that they're kind of only found in Italy and not internationally propagated. Even though, for example, an international variety will be Sangiovese because it's been cultivated everywhere in the world, even though it was originally from Italy. And this whole notion of international variety doesn't really depend on how widely it's grown in total volume, because, for example, Iran is one of the most widely grown grapes in Spain, and therefore also one of the top wine grapes grown in the world, but it's determined to be an indigenous variety, but because it's not grown elsewhere in the world. Let's talk about a few grape varieties specifically. For example, we have Chardonnay, which is the second most widely grown white wine grape in the world. Chardonnay is thought to originate from Burgundy in France. Again, the origins of this is not necessarily that clear-cut, but it's mainly popular because Chardonnay grows easily in many climates and soils, and it doesn't have flavors that are considered very acquired taste. Essentially saying that it's a wine that is kind of neutral. In fact, that is one of the reasons why winemakers like to add oak to Chardonnay wines. Again, that's not the case for most of Burgundy. For example, Le Marché in Burgundy, Grand Cru, that is one of the fanciest Chardonnays in the world, and it's usually only lightly oaked. So Chardonnay can actually exhibit very different characteristics when grown in different climates. For example, in warm climates, you get these ripe tropical fruit flavors, high alcohol and food body. While in cool climates, and the first thing that comes to mind is Chablis in Burgundy, you get these citrus and green fruit flavors, crisp acidity, and a very light body. Another white grape to pay attention to is Chenin Blanc. Chenin Blanc originates from the Loire Valley in France, but it's widely grown in South Africa. It's highly versatile and can be used to produce wines that range from very dry to very sweet, and from still to sparkling. So, it's hard to say, oh, I have Chenin Blanc, therefore it must be so and so. The style ranges hugely. In these cool climates, Chenin Blanc is very acidic, which is why some residual sugar is often left to take off the acidity. For example, in Vouvray. While in South Africa, it could also be known as Steen. It's kind of important to note that nickname for the purposes of the exam. And then we have the Muscat grape, which is not just for Moscato. Muscat is an ancient grape, just like Pinot Noir, that is prevalent all around the world. It has a very strong floral aroma and tends to perform better in warmer climates. And the most famous example, would be the Moscato d'Asti from Italy, as well as the Rutherglen Muscats from France, and the Rutherglen Muscat is from Australia, as well as Vin du Naturel from France. This one I meant, and the Muscatels from Spain. And then we have your Pinot Grigio, also known as Pinot Gris, which is funny because they are the same grape, but the names would then refer to wines made in different styles, very much like SYRAH and SHIRAZ. So Pinot Gris, green means gray, or Pinot Grigio really originated from Burgundy, but Pinot Gris, which is primarily known as a style that is created in Alsace, also known as Grauburgunder in Germany, has kind of a medium plus acidity, medium plus body, kind of almond-like characters. It's a bit off dry to sweet. I think it's very hard to mistake Pinot Gris when you drink it. It's very apple pear flavored and kind of oily is how I would think about it, but not as oily as a Roussanne or Marsanne. While Pinot Grigio, which is super popular, especially in the US and in Italy, tend to be dry, unoaked, and tend to have green apple and lemony freshness. So when you contrast these two wines side by side, I think most of us may not think that these are two different grapes, but they are, just made in different styles. And we also have Riesling, which is actually a very age-worthy wine to be remembered. Sometimes it's hard to remember this because Rieslings tend to be quite inexpensive, and we don't necessarily think of inexpensive wines as highly ageable, but it is. It is native to Germany because it's one of the few grapes that can withstand the coldness of Germany. And it can be made in the full spectrum of sweetness, although now more dry styles are being produced. It's very high in acid, and even and where it achieves ripeness, it produces a petrol kind of aroma. Now, the reason I'm told for why, for example, even a young Eden Valley from Australia, Riesling, can have that petrol kind of aroma is due to the heat. The heat apparently triggers that, while heat and sunshine triggers that, while the cooler climates of Germany produces Riesling that take years to form the petrol aroma via aging. Of course, who can forget the highly aromatic Sauvignon Blanc? So Sauvignon Blanc originates from France, in particular Loire and Bordeaux. Sometimes people forget that Bordeaux is big on Sauvignon Blanc too. It's tend to be always dry and high acidity, except when it's made in Sauternes, where we know it's used to make very sweet wines. It has become kind of the national symbol of New Zealand. The style made in New Zealand is highly distinctive. It's far more fruity and zesty than the styles in Sancerre and Puy-Fumé, which are kind of more lean and mineral. And neither of these styles are likely to be oaked. Now in Bordeaux, Sauvignon Blanc is often blended with Semillon. So a Semillon grape, it's a lot heavier and heavy-bodied, and also more neutral tasting. So it kind of balances off this acidic, light body Sauvignon Blanc. And in California, it's kind of important to remember it's also called Fumé Blanc, although I have rarely seen the term Fumé Blanc on a bottle of wine as seen here in the US. So I don't know if that term is still popular anymore. Some other important white grapes include Semillon. The main thing to remember, Semillon is a blending partner in Bordeaux Blanc, or it's a single variety in Australia, especially in Hunter Valley, which produces a very interesting Semillon, which I personally like. It's, to me, is like the Australian version of Chablis. And then you've got Viognier, which produces a very, very perfumed wine, especially Northern Rhone in Condrieu. And it's famously a blending partner in Côte Rôtie, although it may be technically wrong to call it a blending partner, as what they technically do is co-fermentation. But I don't think the exam asks you to draw the line between those two distinctions. And then you've got Gewürztraminer or Gewürztraminer, depending on whether you're Alsace or Germany, pronounces slightly differently. It's a very aromatic grape, like Riesling, but tend to have lower acidity. This is a very distinctive wine in Alsace, and the key thing to remember is that it has a taste and aroma of lychees. Another important white grape is Trebbiano, Toscano, or Uni Blanc, and this is actually one of the most common white grapes grown in both France and Italy. While in France, it's mainly used in producing brandy like cognac, while in Italy, this is really the most everyday table white wine you have. Now we move on to red grapes. Let's begin with Cabernet Franc, a much older grape. Its home turf is in the Loire Valley of France, where it makes really good red wines in Chinon, and Saumur-Champagny, and so on and so forth. Loire Valley is huge, and there's a lot of Cabernet Franc grown there. All of them don't taste very ripe, because in California, the Cabernet Franc takes on a completely different characteristic. It's a lot fruitier and riper. And it's also important to remember that Cabernet Franc is a blending partner for the right bank, mainly from Merlot in Pomerol and Saint-Emilion. Next up, we have the more famous Cabernet Sauvignon, which is the most popular grape in the world. It originates from Bordeaux, but it is not the most grown grape there, except for the left bank. The most widely grown grape in Bordeaux is Merlot, always important to remember for the exam. Essentially, Cabernet Sauvignon is a relatively easy grape to grow in, especially in the warm sites in the New World. It's kind of thick-skinned and therefore high in tannins, and is resistant to a lot of bugs and botrytis. So key New World sites include California, Chile, Australia. The next wine we talk about is Grenache or Garnacha. So that's mostly blended, but I think a lot of amazing single varieties exist. So most famously is used in the GSM blend, which is Grenache, SYRAH, Mourvèdre, blend in Rhone Valley as well as Australia, and the US has quite a strong Rhone movement going on too. It's also used as blending partner in Rioja, thought to have originated in Spain or Italy. It really thrives in very hot conditions. But despite that, it's also very late ripening. So it's kind of early budding and late ripening. Again, I don't think that's in the syllabus. And it's just got a beautiful aroma. You can tell that I am very partial to Grenache. It's pretty thin-skinned, therefore, even though Grenache is grown in hot climates, it doesn't produce very colorful, very heavily colored, or very, deep-colored wines. That's because it's thin-skinned and therefore lower in tannins as well. Next up, we have Merlot. Tends to be underrated, especially due to the movie Sideways, which is funny. I didn't think that many people watched the movie, but Merlot definitely tanked after that movie. The key flavor of Merlot is red fruit, for example, red plums and cranberries, versus the black fruit style of Cabernet Sauvignon. So it's the most common red wine grape in Bordeaux. It ripens early and makes it a great blending partner for Cabernet. So lots of bulk wine was made using Merlot, but these days I think Cabernet Sauvignon is making more and more bulk wines. So the most expensive wine in Bordeaux itself, for truth, is mainly Merlot, along with Masito, for example, in Italy. These are all thousands of dollars of wine. So Pinot Noir, we think about Pinot as highly elegant, and I always think that it's called elegant because it's got this softer mouthfeel compared to heavier grapes like Cabernet Sauvignon, and the aromas are just so beautiful. So the Pinot expresses itself very differently in different climates. But no matter what, they're all highly aromatic and tend to be red fruited. So key areas include Burgundy and also Champagne, curiously, because Pinot Noir is made to make white champagne. And in Oregon, which produces a very distinctive, more heavy fruited, kind of like Coca-Cola type flavors, and New Zealand, where, for example, in Martinsburg or like Central Otago is very popular. Then we have the ever-popular Syrah of Shiraz. Again, this, like the previous example, Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio, is mainly called different names to indicate different styles rather than different grapes. So they're the same grape, very different style. In the US, curiously, it's called Syrah, although the style is closer to Australian style, and the South African style is somewhere in between, and in South Africa is often known as Syrah as well. And the key flavor note for Syrah or Shiraz is the black fruit and black pepper. In France, it's most well known in GSM blend, as well as Hermitage, which is 100% Syrah, and Côte Rôtie, which is mostly Syrah and co-fermented with Viognier, as mentioned earlier. Some other important red grapes include Zinfandel, which is most famous in California, but let's not forget that Primitivo in Italy is also Zinfandel grape, and in Croatia, it's thought to originate. Who can forget about Sangiovese as well, which is Chianti, Brunello di Montalcino, and Vino Nobile di Montepulciano. Although in these wine regions, you actually use very different clones of Sangiovese. It's a very distinctive wine. It's very red fruited, high in acid, has a distinctive sour cherry taste. And then we've got Nebbiolo, which, it's interesting to me. When I first had a Barolo, I was always told that it's a very, very heavy wine, but it's not heavy in the sense of Syrah or Cabernet Sauvignon. It actually just tastes like a heavier version of Pinot Noir because it's a very thin skin, it's highly aromatic, but it's high in tannins at the same time. When you think about Nebbiolo, you always think pine roses. And then we've got Tempranillo, mainly found in Spain and Portugal, and it's called a lot of different names. For example, Tinto Fino in Ribera del Duero. And the most famous examples are Rioja. And then we've got Malbec, which is thought to originate from Bordeaux, but it's mostly found in Argentina these days. Although I really like the Malbec wine, Cahors, in France. It's got a deep color and iconic black fruit and chocolate notes. Finally, Gamay, which is one of my favorites, known mainly for making Beaujolais, often made using carbonic maceration, which is covered later, and has key red fruit notes such as cherry, strawberry, raspberry, and it could be oak aged and made with traditional fermentation for bottle aging as well. So what are some of the other exam questions? Let me go through some of these with you. For example, which of these grape varieties is known for being used in the wines of Alsace, AOC, Austria, and Eden Valley in Australia? This is kind of interesting. The only right answer here is going to be Riesling because none of the others apply. But it could get trickier than this. For example, which white grape variety is most widely grown in Oregon? Now, when you think of Oregon, you think, oh, wait a minute, don't they produce a lot of Pinot Noir? And then Pinot Noir is found where? Burgundy. And what is the white wine? Burgundy, Chardonnay. So is it going to be Chardonnay? The answer is not. It's Pinot Gris. So there are such tricky questions. Another tricky question, for example, is which relatively rare grape is allowed to be used in the wines of Champagne? Now, You might think again, oh, Champagne, that's north of Burgundy. And, well, which of these grapes can be found in Burgundy or south of Burgundy? Maybe Gamay? Nope, the answer is Arbein. I have never had the wines made using Arbein. I've not heard of it before this question. So, therefore, it's relatively rare. Again, if you have questions or suggestions, please reach out to me at my email address. I do try to make these videos every time I could. I am sorry that it has been a bit long between some video releases. I hope to get back on track this year in 2023. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for the next one.